How do you write a book about one of the most lopsided presidential campaigns in American history and make it interesting? That was the question in my mind when I picked up David Pietrus's book, Roosevelt Sweeps the Nation, FDR's 1936 Landslide and the Triumph of the Liberal Ideal. The previous books of his I had read, in 1920, The Year of Six Presidents, and in 1960, LBJ vs. JFK vs. Nixon, featured some of the 20th century's most titanic political figures. 1936, by contrast, saw Roosevelt demolish the now-forgotten governor of Kansas, Alf Landon. Was there some drama to this election I didn't know about? The short answer is no. Though Landon was a moderate and fairly popular governor, a rare thing for a Republican to be in the wake of the Great Depression, he really did prove to be a hapless campaigner, and Pietrus only devotes a couple of chapters to him. Instead, he cheats a little by focusing mostly on political developments in 1935 and later various minor party candidates. As the title suggests, this book contends that with the conservative Republican orthodoxy of the 1920s losing all popular support in the aftermath of the Depression, Roosevelt was able to forge a new liberal democratic order in the face of various demagogic popular movements, from the corrupt populism of Huey Long to the right-wing Liberty League, to the increasingly anti-Semitic and borderline fascistic radio priest Father Coughlin. This is certainly no hagiography of Roosevelt, however. Several times Pietrus quotes Roosevelt associates as describing him as a purely political being with no real inner self beyond politics. He also dwells on the supposed failures of certain New Deal programs, mostly the National Recovery Act, which attempted to fix prices and wages, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which attempted to prop up farm income by paying farmers to limit their planting and infamously slaughtering millions of pigs. Roosevelt's refusal to endorse anti-lynching legislation is also highlighted. As I said, much of this book concerns political developments in 1935, including the shock assassination of populist Senator Huey Long and the search for a new benefactor by his ally the crooked preacher Gerald L.K. Smith, who attempted alliances with Father Coughlin and Dr. Francis Townsend, leader of the Townsendite movement. Townsend was a small-town doctor who responded to the plight of his impoverished elderly patients by advocating for a type of government-run pension plan. His plan proved wildly popular, and soon Townsend organizations were springing up all over the country and began successfully electing candidates to Congress. If you thought Townsend would support Roosevelt, who had passed Social Security after all, you would be wrong. Townsend's plan differed from Social Security in many respects. For one thing, it was much more generous, at $200 per month, which would be over $4,000 in today's money, and be open to anyone over 60, as opposed to 65. Also, recipients would be required to spend all of their benefits every month, which would be very difficult to enforce, as well as wildly inflationary. Lastly, it would be paid for with a new sales tax, as opposed to the payroll tax. Though Townsend's plan was unworkable, as even he admitted in congressional testimony his numbers simply didn't add up, he viewed Social Security as a betrayal of his vision and allied with Coughlin and Smith to endorse North Dakota Congressman William Lemke, who ran on the Union Party line. Besides Lemke, who largely abandoned his own campaign in the fall of 1936 to focus on saving his own congressional seat, Pietrus devotes time to other fringe candidates, including socialist Norman Thomas and communist Earl Browder, who on orders from Stalin waged a campaign that tacitly endorsed Roosevelt without saying so. And the antics of fascist Fritz Kuhn, leader of the German-American Bund, who endorsed Landon. But more attention is paid to the candidate who didn't run, former presidential candidate Al Smith. Smith, the first Catholic major party candidate for president, had been an old-style progressive when he got demolished in the 1928 election. He had also been a Roosevelt ally. It was to nominate Smith at the 1924 convention that Roosevelt gave his first major political speech since he was stricken with polio in 1921, and it was Smith who had convinced Roosevelt to run to replace him as New York governor in 1928. Things began to change between them, however, when Roosevelt brought in his own advisors and ignored most of his advice as governor in the following years. Then, as Roosevelt's New Deal policies grew increasingly left-leaning, Smith's personal politics became ever more right-wing, perhaps influenced by his new wealthy business associates. By 1935, Smith had joined the newly formed Liberty League, an anti-New Deal organization bankrolled by some of the richest men in the country, which produced a flood of political pamphlets. Democrats worried that Smith might run as an independent in 1936, potentially splitting the Democratic vote, but in the end he confined himself to delivering increasingly intemperate and decreasingly effective anti-Roosevelt screeds.
Here, and this goes with it.
Well, I don't know about the 10-gallon hat, but the accompaniment is okay. It's very kind of you to come here to the building today and extend this invitation and to properly equip me with the headgear so that I'll be known when I get down to Texas. And while you're here, I think fair exchange is no robbery. And I think the right thing for me to do is to present you with a brown derby. Now, if you'll take this more becoming one off, I'll put the brown derby on. And what goes with it? Want to try it again?
As I've said, the election itself was a very one-sided affair and is chiefly remembered for three things. First, Roosevelt's declaration in his convention speech that his generation had a rendezvous with destiny, a phrase borrowed by then ardent New Dealer Ronald Reagan decades later. Secondly, it was the first election predicted using modern scientific polling methods. Previous polling methods, such as the Literary Digest's reader survey, had relied on active responses by its readership and was completely wrong in 1936, while George Gallup's quota sample predicted Roosevelt's win and established the Gallup poll as the standard for decades to come. Thirdly, Roosevelt's election eve speech at Madison Square Garden attacking plutocrats as economic royalists who were, quote, united in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred. He went on to say that while these forces had met their match in his first administration, quote, I should like to have it said of my second administration that in it these forces met their master.
Have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today? They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
This militant rhetoric is remembered fondly by many left-leaning Democrats today who believe the modern party has become too timid and corporate-friendly, but was alarming at the time to even some of Roosevelt's advisors.
In all our history, have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today? They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred, end quote.
A few interesting facets of the campaign might surprise modern readers. For instance, while many people today believe the mainstream press has a liberal bias, in 1936 the vast majority of newspapers endorsed Landon. And for those people who believe that the press' willingness to not report on Roosevelt's disability represented special treatment, Pietrusza relates a story in which Landon confessed to a group that he had no chance in the election and on learning a reporter was present, was able to convince him not to run the story. Press deference to politicians was simply taken as a given on certain matters. In the end, the election was a blowout, one of the biggest landslides in American history. Roosevelt received 60.8% of the popular vote, a total only exceeded by LBJ's 61.1% in 1964 as the highest proportion of the vote since the uncontested 1820 election. He won every state except Maine and Vermont, and the highest ever proportion of available electoral votes, again since 1820. This election changed the nature of the Democratic Party's electoral coalition, with huge increases in the urban vote and also with black voters in the North who, despite Roosevelt's refusal to push for anti-lynching legislation, switched to the Democratic column thanks to the economic benefits of various New Deal work and relief programs. FDR's insistence at the 1936 convention to remove the two-thirds majority rule for nominations permanently ended the segregationist South's veto over future candidates. 1936 wasn't just a personal victory for Roosevelt like Nixon's 1972 landslide. Democrats increased their already huge congressional delegations, reducing Republicans to just 17 senators and 88 congressmen. Ideologically, this election began the long process of permanently sorting liberals into the Democratic and conservatives into the Republican parties.